The tax filing season is underway. You have until April 18th to get those 2016 1040s sent into the IRS. We're going to talk a little bit about our money this morning and how we think about it, or don't, as the case may be, with Gleb Tsipursky. He is the assistant professor of The Ohio State University in the History Department and Decision Sciences Collaborative, and that's at OSU's Newark campus. And he's been a guest with us before. And Professor Tsipursky, it's good to have you back again. Happy New Year.
Thank you. Happy New Year to you, too. And I hope all the listeners get their taxes in before the tax deadline.
It's nice to have that extra weekend, though, just in case.
It is.
We wanted to talk to you this morning about something that you call autopilot thinking, and you say it's got an impact on how we handle our money. Let's start with autopilot thinking. Is it what it sounds like, where we just kind of turn off our conscious brains while our subconscious kind of mans the controls?
It's kind of like that, and it also has to do with habits. So we set up certain habits of thinking that cause us to make bad financial decisions if we don't interrupt these sorts of thinking. For example, how many listeners have, an old car that they keep fixing up and fixing up and fixing up when it breaks down? That's a very typical pattern, kind of just fixing up the car. And they don't think about, well, is it going to be better to get rid of that car and buy a new one? Or is it good to keep fixing up that old car? And that's one of the thinking errors that people make called sunk cost fallacy, where they sink money into an car they already purchased, and they feel like, well, I already put in money into it, I just have to keep doing it. And they don't take the time to think about if it will be better for them to get rid of that old junker and get a new car, because they feel invested, they feel emotionally attached to that old car. And that's the habitual pattern of thinking that's motivated by our emotions. So the autopilot thinking is a very emotional thing, and we feel attached to that old car. The way to counter that is to get rid of sunk cost fallacy, is to look at the situation as it is right now. Ignore the past money that we sunk into the old car and say, okay, we have this car right now that how much money will it fetch on the market? How much money will we have to put into it in order to fix it up when the transmission blows again? Versus how much money will it take to get a new car? And how much money can I spend on that? And so having a decision that's not emotionally attached to our past expenses is difficult, and it takes intentional thinking. So that's what the psychology calls system 2 thinking, more reasonable, rational, logical thinking that looks at our emotions and distances ourselves away from it. So that's an example of how to deal with autopilot thinking in financial decision making.
How does it work when it comes to something like maybe a monthly expense? Now, your example of system 2 thinking as it comes to our vehicles, I applied that to myself. I asked myself about the second or third time that I was getting a gigantic car repair done. I thought, okay, if I had put the amount to pay for this into my savings account every month, if I had divided up into 12 little payments and saved that money, would it have been bigger or smaller than the car payment for a new car? The answer was it would have been bigger. So I'm better off with a new car. Mm-hmm. So next time a repair came up that had that price tag on it, I bid farewell to that vehicle, and I'm driving a different car. But I'm having a harder time. Having the talk with the cable company about how it may be time for us to see other people. Is that the same situation where I've been a cable customer since before it was cool, for 35 years I've had some kind of cable or other, coming into my TV, but it's getting expensive. I'm not always getting what I pay for. I'm having some serious thoughts. How does the system 2 thinking apply to something like that that's been, just a monthly expense that you kind of live with? It's like a utility.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good question. So it's a sort of a similar situation where you add up the expenses over a certain period of time. So let's say you think about a year. How much will the cable cost you for a year? I don't know, $50 per month, let's say. And so that's $600 a year. How is the cable worth $600 to you? And that's how you think about it. You think about it over a long period of time. How much benefit would you get from $600 worth of cable per year? What kind of alternatives do you have to that $600 worth of cable. Do you go with Time Warner or some other cable channel if you really want cable? How much is that worth to you? You put a price tag on the actual amount, and you put a value on your experience of having cable. How much do you care about it? So adding that up over time helps you make a better decision, and not seeing it in terms of a month, but seeing it in terms of a year or many years, depending on how long your contract with a cable company is. A phone might be a similar situation. A phone contract is usually 2 years. So you add up your phone contract, how much is the phone going to be for 2 years versus not having a phone or having a different phone. Some folks make the mistake of, it's often the mistake of renting a phone as opposed to buying a phone outright. And they just simply don't add up the amount of money that renting a phone would cost, a smartphone would cost, versus plus the 2 years of contract versus buying the smartphone with a 2-year contract. So it's a typical mistake that people make, and they don't think about it.
I think we've talked on the program before about how humans are kind of naturally loss-averse, I think is your word for it. That is, when we get stuff, we are reluctant to part with it. In my case, it was a 2003 Pontiac Aztek. Finally, we had to go separate ways. But does that apply in our money as well, as far as when it comes to things like utilities or things that we subscribe to or that we rent or own or whatever? Once we've got them, are we just kind of emotionally reluctant to part with them and try something new?
Yes. So there are a couple of thinking errors that play into this. One is called status quo bias. So status quo bias speaks to the human tendency of desiring stability and not changing things. So even when it's irrational to not change things, let's say your Pontiac, 2003 Pontiac, it might be financially better for you to get rid of your 2003 Pontiac and get a new car, but we are emotionally attached to it. So if you actually examine and sat down and looked at what would be the most reasonable thing for you to do, you can make a decision that it would be to get rid of the Pontiac. But we have an emotional reluctance to do that. That's the status quo bias. It causes us to not want to sit down and make that change. I'll give you another example. It doesn't only happen in our own lives. So companies bring me in as a decision-making consultant on their situation. So, for example, companies are often reluctant to get rid of employees who they had for a long time, even if that employee is not really serving them well anymore, or if the company has changed in such a way that the employee's job is not a good fit for the company. And then I sit down with the company's leadership and talk about, well, the company has changed, its needs have changed, and that employee is not a good fit for you anymore. Why are you keeping that employee around? And that's a conversation that people are often reluctant to have for the same sort of status quo bias, that they're reluctant to change things, and they have emotional reluctance around this. That's one kind of thing that happens. Another kind of thing that's an interesting phenomenon is called the IKEA effect. So your listeners probably know that IKEA is the Swiss furniture giant where people buy their own furniture and they build it themselves. Now, research shows that when you build something yourself, you're more invested into it emotionally than it is actually worth. So let's say you buy a $300 cabinet and you build it, and then it's there. Now, on the open market, in 3 years, it would sell for $150. But you're not willing to get rid of it for $150. You think, I put all this sweat into creating that cabinet. It's still worth, it's whatever, $250. And people are not really rationally thinking about how much it's actually worth because they put their sweat equity into it. So it's called the IKEA effect for that phenomenon. So these are the two kinds of things that tend to go on with loss aversion in the human psyche.
All right, so we invest things other than money in our possessions or investments.
Exactly. We invest our emotions. And that's the autopilot system thinking. That's the emotional thinking that impedes people often from making rational decisions about what's actually good for their financial goals. They are emotionally attached to their possessions. They're emotionally attached to their status quo, to their economic situation that harms them in actually making decisions that are good for their bottom line.
You mentioned status quo bias as it affects employers. I assume that's a two-way street, that it could also affect an employee, a worker who knows in their heart they need a career change, but they've been with a company for a long time. They're used to it. They know everybody. They love that comfort of that paycheck every 2 weeks. Do we then kind of get in our own way of perhaps changing our life course because of that status quo bias?
Oh, very much so. So people who are, that tends to lead to burnout. People keep going to work every time. They lose that sense of purpose, but they just don't. They're reluctant to leave the company, even if it doesn't serve their current needs. They're emotionally attached to their situation, even if they would be quite a bit better off going somewhere else. And they are scared. They're afraid of changing their situations. Now, it's not necessarily the right thing for them to change their situations. Now, I'm not saying that everyone should drop their current jobs and go switch, but people don't even sit down and think about this thing. They don't think about how their current emotions are impeding their ability to sit down and think rationally about what would be good for their well-being. They don't really owe anything to their boss. They don't owe anything to their team members in their current company. They need to care for themselves and their families and their financial well-being. But because of that sense of attachment, that status quo bias, they're unable to even think about changing their jobs.
As a trainer and as a consultant, as a coach, do you have any methods, tips, or techniques that we could use to overcome some of these biases when we're faced with making a decision, whether it's sunk cost, whether it's the status quo, the IKEA effect? Are there some exercises even we could put ourselves through when we think that there's time to make a decision, but we just can't get out of our own way?
Absolutely. So first of all, you can check out Tips on Wise Decision Making. That's at intentionalinsights.org, then nonprofit I run, Intentional Insights. And you can also see it on glebtsipursky.com. So again, you can just Google my name, Gleb Tsipursky, and there's tips and guidelines on how to go through these decision-making processes. So that's kind of for people who want to go more in depth into it. But for a basic exercise, what you can think about is look at yourself a year from now or 5 years from now and think about what kind of a decision you want to make to be the kind of person you want to be a year from now. Do you want to be stuck in the same job, going there from day to day to day to day a year from now? What would be the cost to you of doing that economically and emotionally versus the immediate short-term costs of changing the job, putting in the effort to change the job, but you'll be much better off in the long term. So that's one kind of thing. You can do the same thing for your car. What would be the costs of getting rid of your car and getting a new one? What would be the benefits? And calculating that out into a year-long period and into a 5-year period. So looking into the long term helps us detach ourselves from our emotions. The same thing with the IKEA effect. Do you really want to keep that cabinet around that's only going to sell for $150 and you're not willing to sell it for $250? IKEA effect applies to very many things. A lot of people are reluctant to sell their house because they do a lot of personal housework on it and put their sweat equity into it, improving their house, and they're not being realistic about how much it will actually sell for.
A lot of people call houses, cars, cabinets my baby.
Exactly.
All right.
Same thing. So looking at the long term and where you want to be in the long term is a really good way of detaching yourself from your emotions and being more intentional about your thinking.
Whether it's filling out your taxes or thinking about a new job, maybe keeping the New Year's resolution to just have a better 2017 than your 2016. Some good advice this morning from Gleb Tsipursky. He is assistant professor at the Ohio State University in the History Department, the Decision Sciences Collaborative at the Newark campus. As he mentioned, his company is Intentional Insights. He's president and co-founder. Their website, intentionalinsights.org. He's also a speaker, a trainer, a consultant, and a coach on strategies for decision making. And Gleb, it's great to talk to you again this morning on Perspective.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, Clark.